Democracy tries imperfectly to create structures of governance that maximize that difference, maximize that information, make information-rich environments.
Are you interested in spatial language? What do you think about the ever-present urbanism concept? How can we leverage space as an opportunity? Stay tuned for answers from Keller Easterling.
What is the future for cities? Do you want to learn more about them? Do you want to know how others think about them? Do you want to be part of the conversation? Then this is the right place.
Welcome to What is the Future for Cities podcast. Today, I will interview Keller Easterling, an architect, writer, and the Enid Dwyer Professor of Architecture at Yale University. We will talk about her vision for the future of cities, solidarity and collaboration, spatial language, democracy, and many more. So let's start with a proper introduction. Keller Easterling is an architect, writer, and the Enid Dwyer Professor of Architecture at Yale. Her work explores infrastructure, spatial politics, and global urban systems. She is the author of Medium Design, Extrastatecraft, Subtraction, Enduring Innocence, and Organization Space. Her current research focuses on land activism in the US after the civil rights movement. A 2019 United States Artist Fellow, Easterling's work has been exhibited at the Venice Biennale, among others. She also co-authored Call It Home, a multimedia history of suburbia. Her writing appears in Artforum, e-flux, Log, Domus, and numerous international journals. And with that, Keller, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for your time. I highly appreciate your opinions on the podcast. And let's jump right in. What does the future of cities mean to you?
I think cities have a history of offering to the world a chance at different kinds of solidarity, political solidarity. And now, as we have planetary concerns that we all share with regard to climate, some of those histories of political solidarity, of international solidarity, are more and more important. And so the city, if we can use that opportunity, the cities offer to us transnational networks of activists and thinkers who are even more and more networked and connected now than ever before, but who can often work with a kind of metropolitan powers that are different from those of nations that sometimes get into political deadlocks. Our political life can be more fluid, more networked. That's where the great hope that cities might be for me.
I will ask you, what does the city mean to you? Because you are talking about a very specific perspective. But first, I would like to unpack a bit solidarity, because when I talk with people, they usually say collaboration, not solidarity. And in my mind, those are very similar terms, but I would like to understand, what do you mean by solidarity and whether it's different from collaboration?
It's a very good question. By solidarity, I don't mean all working in lockstep. Actually, I would say the opposite of that. The beauty of the city, and this is how I suppose I think of cities, is that they hold difference. They hold patchiness, lumpiness, the kinds of differences between people and things that generate interdependencies. I don't bake, you bake. I have this, you don't have that. So the kind of idea of solidarity as uniformity would kill all of that. Just as difference, kind of anarchical difference, helps to develop the community economies that are in cities, the interdependencies and interplays that are in cities. Similarly, one isn't thinking these days about, when we're thinking about the planetary, we're not thinking about the universal, the world order, the lockstep political solidarity. We are instead thinking about, I'm only inspired by Anna Singh to use these words, but we are inspired by the ways in which our patchiness and inconsistency is the thing that gives us strength. It's the difference between things, the ways in which our lives are partial, inconsistent, incomplete, different. That's our strength. So I appreciate the question, because a collaboration is messy and filled with redundancies and differences, not comprehensive plans and universal world orders with an elementary particle and all of that.
Thank you very much for mentioning that how messy and petty and lumpy can solidarity and also collaboration be. And I understand that the city is a place to live that. Is there anything else what the city means to you?
So much, of course. The city is not just the metropolitan centers that we recognize. Urbanism is everywhere, and there's no authentic form of urbanism. But what I would call urbanity is stronger when it has a greater quotient of difference, when it tolerates more difference, when it allows more different points of view, when it allows for the coexistence of multiple kinds of exchanges and economies that make it more information rich. That's how, in my view, you dial up that urbanity, even though I wouldn't say that some things just aren't a city or they aren't. There is no way of talking about a city as authentic or inauthentic. It's just that there are varying degrees of relief and mutualism that come from that difference that can be ramified or that can be increased and concentrated.
There are so many things which I think you allude to, but I will not give words into your mouth. What are the 3 biggest fears and concerns regarding the future of cities for you?
It's hard just to come up with 3 along the same lines as what we were talking about when we were saying that there are no comprehensive singular solutions. There are also no singular evil. And it's unimaginative to say that it's not just capitalism and fascism, but caste and racism and whiteness and femicide and psychotic leadership and climate catastrophe and on. And to think that there is only 1 or 2 things that are dangerous, 1 or 2 enemies, is to miss so much of the violence in the world. Even like the good leftist thinks that they must make a singular, declare capitalism the singular evil, and they have the singular solution. But if one does that, however intentioned, you miss most of the violence in the world that's coming in other forms. Moreover, you miss a lot of the camouflaged forms of violence that are aiding and abetting capital. So I see a lot of dangers. I suppose some of the most immediate fears, to be more precise as your question, have to do with the ways in which there is a long history of certain people being on the losing end of resources in cities. And it's not just that they are not given their fair share of resources, but that there are patterns of harm that are built into the way we develop things. That means that they'll be on the losing end. They'll be the ones that experience the floods first. They'll be the ones that experience the fires first. They'll be the ones that don't have the insurance or the means to recoup. And these are patterns that have been set for the last 500 years of colonizing and capitalizing and globalizing. So it's the labor that's on the losing end. It's the people that are on the losing end of also in the line of fire for not just war and murderous forms of policing, but new forms of lethality that are part of climate change. So that's a huge fear. I think one of the other fears I have right now is that we rely on people in cities to fight against those who want to concentrate authoritarian power. And there are times right now where I'm worried that those who we usually take that responsibility, I'm worried about the political imagination. Right now, it sometimes seems that the way people think of what's a radical change is to be thinking of how they sit on an ideological spectrum. They have the singular solution on an ideological spectrum, whereas I think that's, in my view now, quite conservative. and predictable and easily entrapped by superbug powers and strongmen of which now there are too many to mention around the world. So I'm worried. One fear I have is that our imagination on the left, I'm on the left, will still think of radical in those terms. Whereas I think those kinds of thinking about radical are conservative and predictable and easily entrapped, but maybe radical, just to go back to the way Ella Baker uses the word or the way Angela Davis uses the word, radical means getting to the root of something. And the real, much more interesting, much more radical, much more dangerous forms of activists and activist stances now, to me, are those ones that will be working on collaborations with people who are different, reaching across, making alliances, linking arms, taking those risks that aren't pure, that aren't righteous, that aren't, as we used to think of, radical. So I am a little worried about the impoverished political imagination right now, because this is one of those moments where I think the left needs to have a kind of not universal declarations, but has to find ways to make abusive forms of power, instead of our falling neatly into their trap, for them to fall neatly into our trap, to come up with a dizzying set of techniques to overwhelm and displace and outwit and outnumber and outlast. But previously thinking of a radical stance, you think, I should be consistent. I'm thinking, no, inconsistent. Keep them guessing. A binary fight is never off the table, but it needs to be part of a mix of techniques in order to succeed. So the mix is all. The changeability, the inconsistency, that is more radical to me now, less conservative. But I am worried about political leadership, of course, especially now.
Before we move on, before I would ask back, you were also talking about planetary concerns. What are those concerns?
The abusive forms of power in the world have now passed off their abuse to non-human forms with which we cannot negotiate, and will not be able to find techno-solutionist ways out of these problems. So the planetary fears are very real. It is a wetter, hotter planet, and it's over. We've done it. We can no longer prevent it. It's now coping with it and trying to protect those people that are losing end of it. It's terrifying now to look at the strongmen, the Putin, Trump, Modi, Netanyahu, who are playing with old fuel infrastructures, playing fossil fuel infrastructures, old pyrotechnics of war, same tilted playing fields of neoliberalism, the empires masquerading as nations. They're playing with these old forms of lethality and murder, but they're acting like they're just a few of these tough guys can kind of, like Cosa Nostra Dons or something, can work it out amongst themselves. Maybe this is not the fear, but one hopes or one wonders. I'm not sure. I am fearful that we won't be able to bring the new forms of lethality to their door quickly enough to get big waves of hot water to slap them up the side of the head, rather than to stop their old, puny forms of brutality. Will we get there fast enough? Will we be able to redirect this kind of ecocide that they are creating and exacerbating? Will we be able to bring it to their door quickly enough?
After this doom and gloom, I would love to know what are the 3 biggest opportunities regarding the future of cities?
I think that space is something that carries all kinds of values with which culture isn't really conversant enough. And a lot of my work is trying to create another kind of spatial fluency, because the community economies that we have alluded to are exchanges in space. They are values created not with kind of precarious financial abstractions, but with exchanges of physical things in a physical world. everything about proximities and positions and relationships and differences, the shapes of things, the sizes of things, how much sun falls on them, whether they're warm or cold, whether you walk past your auntie's house coming home from school, whether the choir comes and sings at the old folks' home, like the kinds of exchanges that happen that are much more durable forms of value, exchanges of time. In the 20th century, we decided that there would be the economy that we will work on. But in space and in cities, you have multiple economies, multiple community economies, and they create these durable forms of value that aren't subject to the precarities of financial abstraction. Of course, they are subject to precarities of financial abstraction, but one's trying to find the opportunities, to use your word, to make those economies the economies that we really invest in. Those economies are an opportunity. And then second, I would say that many of us now are wanting to call those economies and space, land, landscape, starting to even think about bigger and bigger brackets to that space and those spatial exchanges, to think of all those things as infrastructures. And there's, I think, a real opportunity to talk about these things as alternative infrastructures. And there are different words for it. Some people say soft infrastructure. Some people say live infrastructure. Some people say relational infrastructure, whatever. But there's many of us now talking about that kind of infrastructure of things that are alive. In some ways, whether it's gigantic landscapes or whether it's little communities and farms and just people themselves, sometimes it seems as if capital doesn't get live organizations. It's like live organizations create a superabundance of value. That you plant one seed, you get 10. This doesn't make sense to capital. It doesn't make sense to a world made of math. That superabundance is something that also makes these infrastructures prudent investments because they redouble any resources that you give to them. If you give them dollars, they make values in multiple ways beyond that. So we're also trying to make the case that not only are these investments as worthy as investments in infrastructures like that have concrete and conduit, highways, utilities, so things that we used to think of as infrastructure, conventional infrastructure, but they're prudent investments because of the ways that they create value, spread value into different registers. That, I think, is a huge opportunity. I guess another opportunity that we have now is to think of these spaces as the spaces of care and mutualism and maintenance that have a chance to repair some of the damage that we've done. That we have a chance now to use space and the space of cities for reparations, to break some of the patterns of harm that are embedded in cities that create sort of these people on the losing end, as we were saying before. We have a chance to change that and to work with the kind of nourishing, regenerative aspects of space to repair that harm. I am with someone like Olufemi, who would say that these patterns of harm are historically linked to racism, colonialism, and globalization. And that it's those patterns of harm that are creating and exacerbating climate change. So it's not as if you can address climate change and then when you get done, start to work on reparations. No, he would say, and I would agree, that you work on climate change by working on reparations for patterns of harm that will otherwise only continue. So in some ways, maybe all we're doing now is reparations, with a spatial apparatus of community and with these infrastructures of repair.
This spatial language and spatial fluency with the local economics and care is very interesting. And I'm so glad that while you were talking about such big problems, you can also talk about opportunities, which is reassuring that we do have opportunities. You have been talking about reparations, racism, people on the losing end, and expressions like that. You haven't mentioned specifically equity, which is usually a term coming up in such conversations. Do you think about equity? And what does equity mean to you if you do?
I'm surprised that I haven't used it. I usually do, because the climate change and inequality go hand in hand. That is the point. The last 500 years of colonizing and capitalizing and globalizing have linked the dangers of climate change and inequality. They're inextricably linked. The same people who were colonized are the same ones that are on the losing end of these equations of development, of these consequences of development. Inequality is also the result of seeing the world within a single economy, an economy of finance, rather than all the other economies that exist. I was sharing with a student the other day an article who did a kind of study of white papers, governmental white papers over the 20th century, and saw that early 20th century people would use words like land, corn, sheep, cow, physical things in the world, and that more and more, as the century wore on, people were more and more talking in languages of econometric rather than languages of physical things. This kind of spatial fluency that I'm working on is trying to return a lumpier physical world to our vocabulary. It is the single economy, the single negotiations on financial terms that allowed for the kinds of debt and inequity and so on that could be exacerbated during a kind of neoliberal tilting of the playing fields, or further tilting of the playing fields. And it's the world that we're seeing that inequality further skyrocketing, really accelerating. Single economy can do so much automatic harm and can accelerate that harm.
If we have time, we will get back to that sentence because I have questions about that as well. However, I would like to first still clear out the term of equity because it's fair. In your explanation, you described how equity, inequality, and climate change is connected, but you haven't described equity. And also, you were talking about equity and equality. So what does equity mean to you and what does equality mean to you?
Just etymologically interesting, but when referring to inequality, I suppose I'm referring to this kind of phenomenon of accelerated distances between accumulated wealth and poverty in the planet. The kind of unfathomable excesses of accumulated wealth and the loss of power and resources in the other direction. That is an unfathomable change. And I'm using that word inequality to talk about that tricky word. Equity in legal terms, one also isn't trying to make a kind of self-same world. Again, there's difference. Equity, I usually think of as a legal question. But equity in space, that's harder to talk about because if you're going along with what we've been talking about, there isn't a tally of value in any one kind of way. Pleasures and abundance of difference that is making things more robust. To talk about equity in reparations, too, is I often say that community economies create an incalculable value because it's not coming down to one term, one economy. And the reparations has to address an incalculable debt, cannot decide what will make things equal. It's impossible. There's been too much harm. It's incalculable. It's infinite. Keep in this vein, sometimes I tell my students that if they were really sly and sneaky, they would all together pick one day, use the social media platforms to organize themselves, and all one day push the button to unsubscribe. Just on one split second, bankrupt Elon Musk or something like that. Or they would say, thank you, Elon Musk, and people like you for concentrating so much wealth in one source, because that makes you the perfect target for reparations. It is your unfathomable wealth, which will now be applied to an incalculable debt. I wonder what you're thinking about when you're thinking of equity.
And that's why I'm asking, because I've heard so many people describe equity, equality in so many different ways. And as a future of cities researcher, I believe that cities need differences because they differ by characteristics, by climate, by people living in them, etc. And when people talk about equity and equality, at some point, they arrive to the point that it means the same outcome. And I don't subscribe to that because I believe that it means there would be the same everywhere. And as you mentioned, there are these differences because of lumpiness, because of solidarity, and because of patchiness. And that's why I don't really think that equity and equality are good. Also, I'm coming from Hungary, which lived under socialism for a while, and that didn't work out very well. So I don't really think that approach is useful for the future. However, I completely agree with you that collaboration is needed, solidarity is needed. And that's why I would love to understand, we could go in two ways, and you can choose which do you prefer. So I would love to understand how equality and equity come to terms with the differences you mentioned in your thinking, or we could go towards democracy, because I would love to understand, what do you mean by democracy?
There are things written into law that create inequities, and those can be addressed in different kinds of cases, probably still maintain the differences that both you and I admire about cities. For instance, law itself has written into it a whiteness. The bedrock of most of the laws that we follow have already formatted against, built into them, white supremacy. Are there things to change there to try to approach a more equitable situation? And I'm using the word equitable there not to mean self-same, but just decent, fair, reparative. Yes, there are, of course. What we're talking about, the forms of mutualism and care and maintenance and kinship, are forms that Black feminists, indigenous, anarchist thinkers have been calling for so long as a way to counter monocultures, all sorts, like the ones we've been talking about. They are offering these counter narratives as victims of that harm. And there are, of course, the ways that a kind of white, modern Enlightenment mind has eclipsed their intelligence, their knowledge, and their ways to get that whiteness and those habits of mind, those laws, whatever, get them out of the way of the knowledge and abundance and productivity that are offered by those other ways of being human that have been eclipsed. Democracy with a little d, I guess you mean, is that process of trying to create more information-rich, more multiple voices, more messiness, more redundancy, more exchange, more difference. It's the richness of that one's trying to have some kinds of organs of governance that allow those things to be valued, that you're not foreclosing on that value and that information and that intelligence and that knowledge with kind of authoritarian powers that want to bring everything into a singular control. Democracy tries imperfectly to create structures of governance that maximize that difference, maximize that information, make information-rich environments. I suppose that's the easiest way.
I'm asking this because, in my mind, democracy is very much connected to Karl Popper's description that democracy shouldn't be about who should rule, but about removing the bad regulation and removing the bad rulers. which is very much connected to your notion on removing those regulations which create this divide. And I'm curious whether you are for democracy or not. For me, democracy can be a ground-up approach, which gives more power to the people. And that's a general term. And I'm asking this, or I'm curious about your thinking, because you were talking about the leaders and coming from a culture which doesn't trust the government. Hungarians are usually not looking towards the government to do something. We are doing something, and then whether governments do something, that's out of our question. We don't care, which means that we are much more proactive. We do more than we are looking to the government. It's not cool what you are doing. This kind of looking to the government, it's not cool what you are doing, completely fair. But it also can create this victimhood mentality that I am the victim of your actions, but it doesn't force or creates that empowerment that, oh, I can change it. And then I don't need to listen to you or be on the receiving end of what you are doing. That's why it's very interesting. I wouldn't talk about equity or equality because I'm not interested in that. I'm doing it. I'm just curious whether this victimhood mentality, which can be a learned helplessness, really helps us create a better future for cities and for humanity.
Super important. And I suppose this has everything to do with what we've been talking about, which is that, and I hope that in the United States, now that we are facing a situation where the structures that were meant to make democracy more robust, the checks and balances, the exchanges, the difference, the disagreements, so on, are being erased systematically. One hopes that the medium through which we will govern ourselves and we will overwhelm these kind of puny, insane desires for power, singular power, is by working with what we have in our hands, working with our communities, working with the people that are next door, that will actually strengthen our own political life ourselves in ways that are probably exactly like the ways that communities that have been in oppressive governments before have done so. They develop around that oppression. I would join all of those, too many to mention, who would say you start with what's running through your fingers.
Keller, you have been very generous with your time and answers, and I want to be respectful of your evening. What is your role in establishing the future of cities?
I always think that I'm not doing enough. My role has been as an advocate and a theorist, to some degree a campaigner of some kinds for different ways of thinking about the city. I'm also, I would say, a designer. I design, but I design not master plans and buildings, but another organ of design that I'm trying to make available to my students, that is to design protocols and interplays. So not just that innovation that is the invention, the vaccine, the new technology, but innovation that is the way that things go together, protocols for the ways things go together. So that's something that I am on all those levels trying to both write about and also demonstrate with design projects. For instance, doing projects that demonstrate that we've been talking about community, which is about these kinds of exchanges, but one can provide other forms of landholding organs that give those kinds of communities another kind of breathing space to pool resources, to create a more kind of a complex organization that's indigestible to real estate and gentrification and so on. I would call that a design, an object of design, even though it's a landholding organ. I would also call it an infrastructure, like the kinds we have been talking about. Take something like transportation, worked on things that are saying it's not the new technology of electric cars or automated cars or something like that that is the innovation. Instead, the innovation is how we mix infrastructures of different capacities, from walking and bicycling and cars, which are low capacity, to high capacity transit. So have designed protocols for switching between those two and buildings for switching between those two. So that I would call an interplay or a protocol that is an object of design. And I would also call that switching protocol and infrastructure. I've designed protocols for how suburbs might take the things that accelerated their sprawling growth, like the long-term low-interest mortgage in the United States. There's no reason why you should know anything about that, but it was a way that people made a germ of sprawl. So I designed a protocol that looked at how some of those mortgages might be pooled and valued not according to financial abstractions, but according to climate risks and the reduction of collective risk and the ways in which those could be used to shrink sprawl away from its risky edges of floods and fires, to make a counter contagion. I am a designer and I am writing about that design, and I'm trying also to create right now a campaign for reparations, a persuasion, things on all of those levels. But I am a designer, but I think primarily the word has been what I have used, but the written word with graphic information as well.
Thank you so much, Keller, for your time today.
Yes, thank you for having me. Thank you for your good questions.
It was really interesting to hear from Keller about democracy as maximizing information. Not to mention her addition to think a bit in an anarchist way. Frank Elowski also mentioned this approach to ask questions instead of accepting the status quo in episode 272. You can find out more about Keller online. All the links are in the show notes. What was the most interesting part for you? What questions did arise regarding Keller's approach to the future of cities? What have you learned from this interview? Let me know on Twitter at WTF4Cities or on the WTF4Cities.com website where the transcript and show notes are available. You can also subscribe on the website not to miss any new episodes and leave some feedback. I hope this was an interesting interview for you as well, and thanks for tuning in.
What is the Future for Cities podcast?